Hello, everyone out there. My name is Alex Weston, and I am one of the people here that works for Minnesota Unknown. We are a walking tour company in Minnesota focusing on the weird and unusual, um, history hidden in plain sight. We give walking tours of St. Paul, Minneapolis, and are hoping to eventually spread around the state. If you want to learn more about that, head to minnesotaunknown.com to see what our upcoming tours are. But tonight we are going to do something a little different. We are going to be talking about weird and spooky Christmas traditions. Now, most of our programming at Minnesota Unknown, it is focused on Minnesota, as you might expect. Minnesota is not going to come into this presentation so much because we're mostly going to be talking about European traditions, though a lot of these did eventually migrate to the United States, including Minnesota, and we'll talk about that. But kind of the inspiration for this whole thing was a particular lyric that you might have heard in the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, made popular by Andy Williams in 1963. It says, "There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago." And if you're like me, you might have gone, wait, what? Scary ghost stories? Although this lyric seems strange today, when we began researching it, we found it's referencing a very old tradition, telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve or just generally around Christmas time. This was part of what a traditional English and early American Christmas was all about. The tradition actually goes back centuries, with most of the stories coming from the oral tradition, but it became really solidified in the Victorian era. Um, it was a time when you have new printing technology that enables periodicals and books to be printed far more cheaply and more affordably than ever before. And to meet this market, you have all sorts of publishers in both Britain and America publishing ghost stories specifically for Christmas, knowing that people would often gather on Christmas Eve and read these spooky, scary ghost stories out loud to each other. To quote one collection, this was a book by an author called Jerome K. Jerome. He wrote a book called Told After Supper that's just a collection of ghost stories to read on Christmas Eve. In his introduction, he says, "Christmas Eve is the ghosts' great gala night. On Christmas Eve, they hold their annual fete. On Christmas Eve, everybody in Ghostland who is anybody comes out to show himself or herself. Wherever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about specters. It's a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood." You know, what could be more Christmassy than that? Now, I'm going to pause one sec because I'm getting an error message. I want to also apologize. This is our very first live stream, and we are still, I am still figuring out the technology here. It seems that it's not working on Facebook. Let me just log in. It says, "How you know it's live, folks?" Hello, I am now going live on Facebook as well as on YouTube, if I've done this right. Welcome. I'm going to repeat myself. So those of you who've been tuning in, if anyone's out there on YouTube, I'm going to repeat myself for a moment. So apologies for that. But welcome. My name is Alex Weston. I work for Minnesota Unknown. We are a small 3-person company, a brand new company. and we give walking tours about weird, unusual, and little known aspects of Minnesota history. Though today I'm not going to be focusing on Minnesota specifically. I'm going to be talking more generally about a whole host of customs from Europe. And some of these did make their way with immigrant groups to the United States, including Minnesota. But for the most part, we're talking about traditions that are associated with Christmas time in Europe. Not just any traditions, though, dark, spooky traditions. And I've started by diving into the Victorian custom of telling ghost stories. This was an era in which many publishers are publishing Christmas annuals that are just filled with ghost stories because nothing said Christmas to the Victorians more than a spooky ghost story. And in fact, this is a tradition that goes way back. A lot of the most popular ghost stories of all time were published originally for the Christmas market. For example, M.R. James is considered by many to be really the master of the Victorian ghost story. He was, in fact, a provost at Cambridge and Eton College, and all of his ghost stories were originally written to be performed for his students on Christmas Eve for like a special Christmas Eve spooky thing. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell, The Werewolf by Clemens Hausman, and many other classics were all published as Christmas stories. In fact, it's no accident that the most famous Christmas story of all time, Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol, is also a great ghost story. This was really a deliberate attempt to tap into the market because although he might lambast greed in the figure of Ebenezer Scrooge, Charles Dickens was himself quite the capitalist, and he wanted to tap into the market. He knew that ghost stories were selling good. He was the editor of several periodicals, and he composed actually not just a Christmas Carol, but several ghost stories specifically set at Christmas time. This includes The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton, published in 1836 and later incorporated into the Pickwick Papers, The Mother's Eyes from 1840, The Chimes in 1844, The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain, A Fancy for Christmas Time is the subtitle there, in 1848, The Signalman in 1866, and in 1859, Dickens also published a book called The Haunted House. And this was actually a series of 8 short stories, 3 of them written by Dickens, the others written by others, all ghost stories with a framing device where you have 8 friends staying in a haunted house and each of them encounters a different ghost. And all of this is perfectly seasonal for that time. In fact, the real contribution of Dickens is that his Christmas stories actually had something to do with Christmas and often had a pretty strong moral to them. Most Christmas ghost stories, they were just trying to scare people. They weren't trying to give any sort of a moral. Now, the Christmas Eve ghost story tradition, if you just Google this sort of thing, you'll see it written that this was a particularly British thing, but I've done some research and found it's just as popular in the United States. So this was both a British and American thing. And in fact, one further wrinkle that Americans added, not only would they tell ghost stories, but singing Christmas murder ballads was also a particularly popular American pastime. Now, murder ballads, that's a song telling the story of a murder. These were really the true crime podcasts of their day. A lot of them were based on real cases, and they would circulate orally through the folk tradition. But a lot of these ballads would get a verse or two inserted to make it set on Christmas Eve or around Christmas time to turn a regular murder ballad into a Christmas murder ballad. Although that being said, some of the most famous murder ballads in American history are legitimately set on Christmas because they're based on real murders that happened on Christmas. Unfortunately, statistically, Christmas actually has one of the higher homicide rates out of any date, probably because of alcohol and family spending time together who might not like each other that much. 2 of the most famous murders to inspire ballads include the song Delia's Gone and the song Staggerlee, both based on real murders, both committed on Christmas Eve. Now, some people went beyond merely telling ghost stories and hosted whole sort of spooky ghost themed parties. They would have skeletons as decor. You would drape the lights in an eerie blue mask so that the lighting is creepy. In the Book of Indoor and Outdoor Games with Suggestions for Entertainments, written in 1904, American etiquette guru Florence Kingsland gave instructions for an elaborate Christmas Eve ghost party. So you were supposed to have all sorts of spooky decorations, skeletons, so forth. Guests were to arrive in a winding sheet and a mask. She says each mask should have, quote, a distinctive mark on his or her forehead, a splash of blood, red paint, a bone attached to the top of the mask, the picture of a spade, a skull, anything gruesome. Guests would then try to guess each other's identities. They'd play spooky games. They'd do fortune telling games. And then, of course, tell ghost stories. And in her intro to this recommendation, Kingsland wrote, the veil that separates the realm of spirits from that of mortals has always been held by reverent tradition to be thinner on Christmas Eve than any other time of the year. Ghosts are said to revisit their old haunts and homes. Hence the Christmas custom of revealing stories of spectral visitants. A phantom reunion is therefore appropriate to the day. So that was published in 1904 and really encapsulated the late Victorian trend of ghost stories on Christmas. But really the only thing that was new for the Victorians about this was they isolated it to Christmas Eve. Going back further, Christmas was an expansive season stretching really from November to February. And that whole season was spooky and a time when witches, ghosts, goblins, demons were thought to be on the prowl. And in fact, a lot of what we today associate with Halloween originated as a Christmas tradition. Now, in fact, at the time that Kingsland's writing, around 1900, Halloween is just starting to become popular in the United States. It was really a sort of specifically Irish and Scottish holiday before that. And Halloween would eventually displace Christmas as the premier spooky holiday of this country. But if you were to celebrate Halloween before 1900 or before the 1920s even, Halloween, there was a general belief that there were spirits about, but they were thought to be benevolent. It wasn't supposed to be scary. Halloween originally was really more of a harvest festival, and a lot of the decorations that people like Kingsland are recommending for their Halloween parties, they're all just sort of general fall kind of things. It's in many ways more similar to Thanksgiving than Halloween. And there were traditions of divination games, all sorts of, fortune telling games and things, but that was pretty much as spooky as Halloween got until around the 1920s. And what happens is basically Christmas is continuing to get more and more commercial, more domesticated, and the spookier elements of Christmas start to become de-emphasized, and Halloween takes up the slack. And by the 1920s, Halloween is becoming the major spooky holiday in the United States. And this new scary version of Halloween actually gets exported back to Ireland and Scotland and around the whole world. In fact, one quote I found, this is from the Book of Halloween, published in 1919. It's one of the first American books giving advice about Halloween parties. And the author specifically says, all superstitions, everyday ones, and especially those pertaining to Christmas, have special value on Halloween. And she goes on to list a bunch of things that were formerly seen as Christmas traditions, like carving jack-o'-lanterns. That was a Christmas thing. Telling ghost stories. That was a Christmas thing. Going door to door in scary costumes and begging for treats. That was a Christmas thing. All of this starts to become associated with Halloween. So let everything I just said be the kind of intro, a little warm up to delving deeper, because these traditions go deep. And so we are going to examine Christmas in the broader context, the way Christmas was traditionally from the late Middle Ages and early modern period in Europe until basically the end of the 1800s. It's one thing to understand about Christmas is until the late 1800s, Christmas was not a day. Christmas was a whole season. Basically, it could vary from region what the sort of start and end dates of Christmas are, but at its broadest, it stretched from St. Martin's Day, or Martinmas in English, that's November 11th, all the way to Candlemas in February 2nd. That whole season, 56 days, that's Christmas to a medieval or early modern person. In some regions, there are other dates. So, for example, in Scandinavia, December 13th, St. Lucia's Day, that's the start of Christmas. In England, eventually it gets narrowed down to the 12 days of Christmas. So that starts on December 25th and goes through Epiphany, January 6th. But still, there's this idea until really recently that Christmas is more than one day. December 25th is the Feast of the Nativity, the day in which we celebrate Jesus' birth. So that's obviously the central day within the Christmas season, but Christmas is about much more than that. And they saw Christmas as a time full of feast days and celebrations, but also a uniquely scary time. This was a time when it was thought that all sorts of demons and ogres and witches and fairies and elves are out and about for good or ill. So it's a supernaturally charged time of year. It's a time when there might be good spirits, but also lots of bad spirits. And it was in many ways uniquely dangerous. And you see through a lot of the important days in the Christmas season, this idea that there's always some sort of bad thing that goes along with any good thing. So if you have a popular saint or a gift bringing figure, there's going to be some sort of dark, scary version of that same saint or gift bringing. And on that note, I'm just going to list off some of the more important days, because within this were various saints' days that had their own traditions attached to them in specific regions. So again, the season kind of kicks off with November 11th, St. Martin's Day. That's also known as Old Halloween, by the way, because on the older Julian calendar, that was October 31st. November 30th is St. Andrew's Day. November 4th is St. Barbara's Day. December 6th is St. Nicholas's Day. December 13th, St. Lucia's Day. December 21st, St. Thomas's Night. December 25th, Feast of the Nativity. January 6th, Epiphany. And February 2nd, Candlemas. All of those dates were important at different times. Now, this brings up the fact, you notice a lot of these are saints' days, and it is hard to overstate the importance of saints for your average layperson in the Middle Ages. This was a time in which there was a general Christian hegemony across Europe. Apart from small Jewish communities, everyone was just kind of assumed to be not just Christian, but specifically Roman Catholic, at least until the Reformation comes along in the 1500s. And that assumption doesn't mean that everyone was super religious in the way that we think about it. They were as a kind of default, but your average medieval or early modern Christian only went to church once or twice a year. And they would go to, say the Mass, take communion, hear confession from priest, and then they'd be like, okay, I'm done with that for a while. It was a chore. It was something that they knew they should do because it'll reduce their time in purgatory. They'd been baptized as an infant, so they know that saves them from hell. But for day-to-day matters, saints were what actually impacted people's lives. If you wanted to pray for something specific in the here or now, not what happens after you die, the saints were the ones that you do that to in medieval Christianity. And so that's why all sorts of traditions follow the lives of the saints and the feast days of the saints, because this was really the most important aspect of medieval people's faith. Now, that's going to change with the Reformation, because some Protestant theologians start saying that the saints should not be revered the way that they were. In fact, devotion to the saints becomes a big no-no in many Protestant communities. And this has a major impact. You see a lot of traditions that were associated with specific saints in Protestant areas kind of getting reworked. But it also has an effect in Catholic areas, because now that there's multiple denominations vying for people's affections, as it were, suddenly authorities really care that people start going to church. And in both Catholic and Protestant areas, attending church weekly becomes mandatory, and they're keeping track. You can get fined for not going to church. And not only are they going to church, they're preaching in the vernacular to try to make sure people actually understand the theology. They're making people sign catechisms. And this all starts to shape different previous folk traditions, and we'll talk more specifically in different ways that happened. I bring all this up because when you start talking about holiday origins, the other thing that often gets brought out is the idea that all of our holidays, like Christmas, are pagan originally, that these are pre-Christian holidays that got kind of a Christian branding slapped on them. And there's probably some truth to this, but it's also probably completely overstated. The history of this notion dates back to the Reformation. In fact, some of the Protestants, reformers, were the first to say that things like Christmas were actually pagan. And this wasn't really based on any sound historical research. It was based on the fact that this didn't seem to reflect any specific verse in the Bible, and to these radical Protestant reformers, anything that's not biblical is pagan, which to them was synonymous with demonic. So as a part of generally an anti-Catholic smear campaign, Protestants start saying that things like Christmas were actually just pagan holidays. This gets picked up in the 19th century by the emerging field of folklore studies. And a lot of these guys suggest it for a very different reason. A lot of them, they basically were trying to uncover secrets of Europe's past, which they thought was held in the tales and customs of people in rural areas. They had this assumption that somehow people living in rural, isolated areas were living the way they had been for centuries, unchanged. So if we want to learn about Europe's past, we have to look to these small communities and start collecting fairy tales and that sort of thing. And it's a rather dubious assumption, the idea that nothing had ever changed in these villages. In fact, modern studies show that actually the more isolated a place is, the faster that culture changes. But they were interested in the past, and they were also, many of them, part of nationalist movements. So, for example, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm, the fairy tale guys, they were trying to research German culture because they wanted to unite German-speaking people with a shared idea of a past. So all of this meant they had a lot of incentive to try to find things that were pre-Christian, because it's pretty obvious that Christianity is not German to begin with. It comes from Jerusalem originally. So if you want to find something German, you got to go back before the Christian missionaries. And so they just sort of took any old thing that didn't seem to fit with institutional Christianity and said, it must be a pagan remnant. Eventually this gets expanded by an Egyptologist named Margaret Murray, who theorizes that all of the people who were executed as witches were actually surviving practitioners of an ancient pagan religion. And this gets just sort of repeated around in a lot of books in the early 20th century, and you'll still see it on the internet today. The problem with all this is there's no actual evidence for any of it, specific evidence. Now, are holidays probably influenced by pre-Christian celebrations? Undoubtedly. But tying any specific thing, saying this Christmas tree tradition, for example, specifically originated with this belief in a pre-Christian God, we just don't have evidence for that. So that's why I was talking so much about the frame of mind of medieval Christians, because I think it's more helpful to say that our holiday traditions emerged from medieval folk religion. And that folk religion was ostensibly Christian, but probably had all sorts of old pagan elements to it. But that's not the same as saying that a pagan holiday was just rebranded. It's just a lot more complicated than that. Now, having said all that, let's get back into some spooky things. So I just mentioned Jacob Grimm. He was one of the first to popularize the idea that all these sort of fairies and demons and elves and gnomes and kobolds and other sort of magical creatures from European folklore were actually pre-Christian gods that got kind of transformed. That idea has gone by the wayside by people who studied these sorts of things. But what is clear is that from prehistory up to relatively recently, Europeans lived in an enchanted world. Things like fairies, elves, gnomes, dragons, these were real. And in the wintertime is when they were at the most dangerous. That's something pretty much everyone was in agreement. And again, tied to these specific dates on the church calendar. You often had this idea that once St. Martin's Day comes on November 11th, now we're in a uniquely dangerous time until February 2nd when the season ends. And Jacob Grimm looked around at a bunch of traditions and started giving labels to them. And a lot of those labels are the ones that people who talk about these sorts of things still use. One of the most common is the wild hunt. And that is a term that Jacob Grimm came up with. And this describes actually a whole host of traditions across Europe. But the basic thing they all have in common, you have some kind of ghostly figure leading a whole troop of other ghosts or fairies or elves or demons or whatnot through the night, and you don't want to get caught by them. Sometimes they are actually hunting something, but more often than not, it's just this kind of wild, troop of things. So for American listeners, actually, you might be familiar with this through the country western song Ghost Riders in the Sky. This is a song made famous by Johnny Cash and others, where you have a cowboy and he sees a bunch of ghost riders in the sky and they say, change your ways or else you'll be one of us. That's actually just a reinvention of the wild hunt story. You have a ghostly figure at the head of this procession. Sometimes there are lost souls. There's the souls of unbaptized babies. There's demons. There's monsters. It varies, but you have this leader of the hunt and their spooky entourage, and they are said to prowl about throughout the winter months. And in some regions, specifically the days between Christmas and Epiphany, that's January 6th, the 12 days of Christmas, that's when the wild hunt is about. So you don't want to be outside at night or the wild hunt might catch you. And if they catch you, you have to join them. Now, this hunt varies a lot, especially in who's leading it. Jacob Grimm was particularly keen to emphasize that in some regions, Wotan, or the Germanic version of the god Odin, is said to be the leader of this hunt. And in fact, he leads the hunt from his 8-legged horse. So that does seem to be a carryover from pre-Christian beliefs. But you also have in Britain people like King Arthur or Sir Francis Drake, real historic figures, but not Arthur, but Francis Drake, leading this wild hunt. Sometimes it's a female figure. Sometimes it's said to be Herodias or Salome. This were the biblical figure who asked for the head of John the Baptist. And according to one story, when the head of John the Baptist is presented to her, she touches the head and it suddenly wakes up and blows her, and she just flies up into the sky, and she's still flying around today, and she's gathered a host of other sinners and lost souls and demons and things, and you don't want to get caught. This is an incredibly common motif that, like everything I'm about to talk about, has a million variations. The great thing about folk beliefs is there's never one canonical version of any of it. Every town, every region, every county had its own variation. But one thing they have in common is winter generally, Christmas specifically, is when you want to watch out for these ghostly riders. Now, if that's not enough, there's also such a thing as a belief in Christmas werewolves. So this is particularly common in kind of Alpine and German-speaking regions, as well as parts of France. And one of the beliefs is not only that werewolves are uniquely out and about during the holiday season, but that actually that's one of the origin stories of werewolves. If you're born on Christmas Day, or in some versions if you're born on Christmas Eve, or in some versions if you're born at any point in the 12 days of Christmas, you are doomed to become a werewolf. Another sort of variation on that, women born during that period are doomed to become a witch, whereas men become werewolves. In much of Eastern Europe, so particularly kind of Czech areas, and especially getting into Ukraine, St. Martin's Eve, so the night before St. Martin's Day, November 11th, wolves can talk, but you don't want to hear what they have to say, because if you hear what the wolf says, then you are doomed to become a werewolf. Similar thing happens with vampires. In Romania and Ukraine, St. Andrew's Eve, that's November 29th, that's when vampires come out. And they stay out until April 22nd, but it's very important that on that first night, you put um, garlic and crosses and other charms in your window, and then the vampires know, okay, this house is off limits. Otherwise, if you don't do that on the night that the vampires come out, um, you might be inviting the vampire in. And then the vampires sort of return to their grave on St. George's Eve, which is April 22nd. That's the end of vampire season in these regions. So that's just a couple example of general dark and spooky things. And these are beliefs that are found in different ways across Europe, not everywhere, but you'll find enough isolated communities in France, in Germany, in the Alps, in Italy, in Eastern Europe, to get a sense that probably these traditions are all interrelated. But if you want to go somewhere really isolated, you're going to find really unique traditions. And the key example there is Iceland. And in Iceland, the big thing you want to watch out for is Grylla or Grylla. Side note, I'm terrible at pronouncing things from other languages, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of every single word that I say here. So apologies to anyone who speaks Icelandic or French or German or any other language. But Grylla, she is this sort of evil cannibalistic witch that is living in the mountains of Iceland. And all year round, she is looking for children to eat. But she's particularly active around Christmas. And in fact, it's around Christmas that Grylla comes down from the mountains and searches for kids who are out and about. So it's sort of one of those basic boogeyman type stories. You don't want to be caught out and about, or else Grylla will find you. And she has company. Over the years, Grylla has gained this sort of whole entourage. There are 13 mischievous, kind of elf-like, troll-like goblin men known as the Yule lads. That's their English translation. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Icelandic one. Look it up. But the Yule lads, there's 13 of them, and they each have their own sort of shtick. So there's one whose name translates to like the spoon licker, and he's just there to lick your spoons. So pretty harmless. Some of them play more serious tricks, but each of them has their own kind of like practical joke kind of thing. And as far as European folk traditions go, it's, you know, not nearly as frightening as, say, Grylla herself, who, again, is out to eat children. But in terms, speaking of things that eat other things, if you don't have new clothes on Christmas, it's thought that this giant cat, known as the Yule cat, will devour you. So that's another Icelandic tradition. Now, a giant cat, Iceland's the only one that I could find that has that. But there are sorts of other creatures that are associated with Christmas traditions. One of the, especially, you see a lot of horses and a lot of goats. And probably the most famous horse these days that's gotten a lot of attention on the internet is the Mari Lwyd. This is a Welsh tradition. And what it is on Christmas Eve, or in different parts of Wales, other days within the Christmas season, you go door to door with a horse's skull on a stick and a sheet kind of covering it. And it's usually rigged up with a string, so the horse's mouth clacks and it knocks on the door and has riddles. And you're supposed to trade riddles with the Mari Lwyd. And eventually, when you can't solve the riddle anymore, the Mari Lwyd has to come in and either gives treats or punishments. There's a lot of variations on this. Some on the internet have described it as basically a scary horse skull shows up and challenges you to a rap battle, which I've seen some videos of this, and it's fairly accurate. This has become pretty popular on the internet lately. But it's actually just one of many traditions across the British Isles that are known as hobby horses. And these are where you have a horse skull of some kind and you go door to door. And these happen at various times throughout the year. And someday maybe I'll do a whole presentation just on hobby horses. But it's worth noting that the Mari Lwyd is just part of this wider tradition. Why? Well, again, people have looked for explanations that maybe it represents some ancient Celtic god or goddess or something. But it might also be that in a rural area, horse skulls were available. You know, this was a farming community that uses horses They die every now and then. And you rig a horse skull up so it clacks. That's just an effective bit. It's this cool, spooky thing. And so if you're trying to have some wintertime fun, pranking the neighbors, this is just a thing that you do. It's also done with goat skulls in different areas. And speaking of goats, one of the more unusual goat or sheep related things I came across was the Derby ram. And this is a story in the town of Derby. And the story is that there was this giant ram. We're talking like 15 stories tall. So this kaiju sized ram showed up on Christmas Day. And the townspeople did what they did. They tried to save their town by going after the Derby ram and slitting its throat to kill it. And that was a big mistake because this thing is enormous, and the entire town of Derby was washed away in the like flood of blood that came out from this ram. So weird story, but it's immortalized in several songs. And one of the traditions in Derby to this day is to have a ram's head that represents the Derby ram, a normal sized one, presumably. And you go door to door and you sing the song and you beg for treats. So that's fun. Now, bringing up that idea of going to door to door and begging for treats, this is an incredibly common thing. And again, in the United States, we think of trick-or-treating. It's a Halloween thing. But this is much more commonly a Christmas thing, though it happens at different times in different places. One example would be in Norway and other parts of Scandinavia. There's the tradition of Yule bucking. Now, the Yule buck, that means the Christmas goat. And traditionally in Scandinavia, the Yule buck is the gift bringer. So instead of Santa Claus or Saint Nick or whoever, on Christmas, this Christmas goat shows up. And often, again, it's a sort of hobby horse kind of thing where you have a real goat skull, or you have some sort of a puppet, or you have someone dressed up. It can vary quite a lot. But after the Christmas goat shows up, then everybody in town puts on their own scary costumes. They are homemade sorts of things out of, burlap and fur and whatever, just whatever spooky costume you can come up with. And then you go door to door and you sing a little song. And if a person has a treat to give you, they give you the treat. If not, you're supposed to play some sort of practical joke. So it is literally trick-or-treating, but it usually happens in the days between Christmas and New Year's. And this is one tradition I can say for certain came to Minnesota. We have actually photos in the Minnesota Historical Society archives of people in Yule bucking costumes in rural Minnesota. And in fact, I've seen in different internet groups that I'm in, people talking about this being a thing that they did as late as the 1970s. So this Yule bucking tradition from Norway did survive into Minnesota, but it's similar to the practice of mumming or wassailing throughout the British Isles. Again, dressing up in costumes, going door to door, sometime during the 12 days of Christmas. It's this incredibly common thing. Now, the other thing that you see across Europe is various gift-bringing figures. Someone who comes at some point in the holiday, gives kids gifts, and almost always, either that person also can dole out punishments, or they have a separate figure that accompanies them that doles out punishments. Now, this isn't exactly spooky, but I have to include it because it's one of the most unique things I came across. The gift bringer in the Catalan region of Spain is Tío de Nadal. Now, in Spanish, tío means uncle, but this is Catalan. It means log. So Tío de Nadal was the Christmas log. And this is a log that comes out on December 8th, which is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And the log has like a face. It has googly eyes. It has a smiley face, and kids put like a little blanket on it, and they have to take care for it and give it a little bit to eat every night. And then on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, the kids hit it like a piñata, singing this song that translates to "Poop, Tio, hazelnuts and nougat. Do not poop herrings, they are too salty. Poop nougats, for they taste better. Poop, Tio, almonds and nougats. And if you don't want to poop, I'll hit you with a stick. Poop, Tio." And poop, Tio, that's, caga tio, and that's often what it's called as well. And sure enough, if the kids have been good, the log poops, and little presents, usually candy, comes out of the back of this log. Now, what could be weirder than that? Well, this is not the only poop related Christmas figure in Catalan. There is also what they call the caganer, and that literally means the pooper. Um, and one of the popular things in Catalan is for every community, every church to have a massive nativity scene. Basically, it's like a miniature Bethlehem. So you don't just have the barn with Jesus and the manger and Joseph and the shepherds. You have, hundreds of figures in this miniature little town. And the fun tradition is somewhere there's a sculpture of a little guy taking a poop. And, usually it's fairly graphic as far as things go. You see his little butt cheeks, you see a little turd below him. And so the big fun thing is for all the kids to look through the nativity scene and find the caganer, find the pooping guy. And these have become pretty commercialized lately. You can get like officially branded caganer online. You can get, a Marvel Avengers character pooping, or you can get a Disney character. There's one of the Little Mermaid pooping that, if you've ever had questions about mermaid anatomy, look that one up. It answers at least one of those questions. So yeah, fairly unique. But the most common gift bringer across Europe is, of course, St. Nicholas. Now, in the United States, we think of St. Nicholas as synonymous with Santa Claus. I'm not going to talk about Santa Claus today, but I want to say that we should think of Santa as separate from St. Nicholas. Santa Claus comes on Christmas Eve. He lives on the North Pole. He has a sleigh pulled by reindeer. He comes down the chimney, so on and so forth. Whereas St. Nicholas is a Roman Catholic saint. He was a real bishop who lived in the 3rd century. He comes on the eve of St. Nicholas's feast day, which is December 6th. So he comes the evening before December 5th, and gives presents then. And basically, probably where this all started is St. Nicholas, by the early Middle Ages, had just become one of the most popular saints. Again, the real guy, as much as we know about him, which is not much, he lived in the 3rd century. But he had slowly become the patron saint of all kinds of things. He's the patron saint, among other things, of children, of sailors, of repentant thieves, of all kinds of things. But in particular, his association with children made him the perfect figure to come and give gifts during the Christmas season. And so in different areas, people might put out their shoes, and then, if they've been good, they get something in their shoes. If they've been bad, maybe they get coal. But more specifically, you start to see in different areas, St. Nicholas doesn't come alone. He comes with a companion. And St. Nicholas is the good cop. The companion is the bad cop. So St. Nicholas can come to give gifts to good children, but somebody's with him giving punishment to bad children. And who that person is, what that punishment is, that's what varies. But it's an incredibly common thing. So some of them are human. So throughout France, you have Père Fouettard, which means like father whipper or old man whipper. And he dresses in kind of rags, and he has a whip with him or a bundle of sticks. And, good kids get gifts from St. Nicholas. Bad kids get a beating from Father Whipper. I should mention, a lot of these traditions stem from a culture in which capital punishment against kids was just the most commonly accepted form of parenting. And I know everyone, myself included, has strong opinions on that, but to understand these traditions, this just comes with the territory. So fair warning. In other areas, particularly German-speaking ones, you have a similar figure named Knecht Ruprecht, which means like servant Rupert or farmhand Rupert. He comes into the house and asks children whether they can pray, and if they can say the proper prayer, they receive apples, nuts, and gingerbread. But if they can't, he hits the children with his bag of ashes. Or sometimes he gives naughty children a switch, like a stick, and that's for their parents to then use on them. You have a similar thing in Swabia and Franconia, which today is part of Bavaria. This is a guy named Pelsmartel, and he comes on the eve of St. Martin's Day, so November 11th, evening of November 10th. And his name means pelts Martin. And the pelts could mean one of two things. It could mean, just like in English, pelt, it could mean a fur, like an animal pelt, or it could mean to hit. And it's a good ambiguity because he dresses in furs and he hits bad children. That's one of the things he does. In fact, he's actually known, he goes around and tosses candy on the ground to lure children to pick it up, but it's bait. Don't be fooled. You're not supposed to pick up the candy from the Pelzmartel, because when children dash forward to claim their prize, they get swatted with the stick. And sometimes it's this whole kind of game. Pelzmartel comes in, he tosses the candy. Can you get the candy without getting hit with the stick? It's kind of a fun game. This is probably related to Peltsnickel or Belsnickel. This is another fur-covered figure in different alpine areas that often accompanies St. Nicholas on December 5th. And when St. Nicholas is giving candy, the Belsnickel is there to punish bad children. And this actually today is more found in the United States, specifically Western Pennsylvania, where a lot of German immigrants settled, than in Europe itself. And the American one is known as Belsnickel. And some of you, if that name sounds familiar, it might be because there's an episode of The Office, which is a show set in Western Pennsylvania, where the character of Dwight Schrute dresses up as Belsnickel. And a lot of people probably thought this is a thing they made up for The Office, but nope, it's a real thing you'll still find in Western Pennsylvania. But I've been saving the best for last. The most famous sort of spooky, punishing, dark companion of St. Nicholas is, of course, the Krampus. And if you've been on the internet in the last few years, you've seen pictures of this guy. By the way, as an aside, I was hoping to have a slideshow with all sorts of cool images, but I was having trouble getting the slideshow thing to upload into the service we're using to live stream. This is our first live stream, so I'm really sorry that there's no pictures. Go Google all this stuff afterwards. There's really cool images on the internet. But the Krampus, he is this furry, often kind of devil-looking figure. He has a really long tongue. He has horns. And in the popular American conception that you see in a lot of like movies and comic books and things, he's portrayed as like this evil counterpart to Santa, sometimes even Santa's enemy. And he's here to just dole out punishment and, steal children and eat them and who knows what else. This is a pretty big misunderstanding. In the original traditions, he is an accompaniment to St. Nick. He's working for St. Nick. So although he's the bad cop to St. Nick's good cop, he's not St. Nicholas's enemy. Also, it's often thought of in America as a German tradition. It is, but not like all of Germany. Specifically, it's really kind of an Alpine tradition, much more Austrian than Germany. And you'll find it not everywhere in Austria, but really in specific regions in kind of Tyrol and Bavaria and other parts. And it varies quite a lot. Every little sort of valley has its own version of the Krampus, and they're not always called Krampus. The word Krampus probably comes from claw, but nobody called it Krampus until the mid-1800s. It had all sorts of various regional names. And in fact, if you Google Krampus today, you'll probably see a lot of vintage greeting cards with pictures of the Krampus. And this colors our perception of the figure. Those were mostly made by people in German cities that thought this tradition was weird. They did not grow up with it. These were sort of novelties that were sold the same way a lot of, today you can buy Krampus Funko Pops and things. And these Christmas cards, these Krampus carton, as they're called, was kind of the same deal. It was often stuff created by people who were not a part of that culture, and in many ways perpetuated misunderstandings. So a traditional Krampus costume, it was whatever you could throw together. So if you have an old sheepskin, cool, put that on. You have some horns. If you need to darken your face up with some dirt, some ash, whatever to do to disguise yourself and look scary. There was no like one visual image of the Krampus until you get these cards and you have artists that are really just drawing on traditional ideas of the devil or Satan. Um, Now, the Krampus has all sorts of other related equivalents. For example, there's the Klausen, and they're another sort of furry, scary thing that the Klausen, they don't accompany St. Nicholas, but they accompany St. Barbara, specifically the wild Barbaras. And this brings us to another aspect, which is that throughout this whole period, you have different saints' days. And it seems to have been second nature to people that if there's a good saint, they should have their like evil equivalent. So there are what are often known as the wild Barbaras in parts of the Alps, sometimes known as Barborki, sometimes Barbella, depending on the local language. And St. Barbara's Eve is December 3rd. And on the eve of that, troops of women, this is one of the few things where it's mostly women dressing up as these things, they parade through town, breaking into homes with switches, whips, carpet beaters to swat naughty children. And some areas, the women all comb their hair forward over their face, kind of like the girl that comes out of the TV in the movie The Ring. So it's, spooky looking. Other ones, they make masks out of like moss and pine cones, so that these kind of like woodland spirits come alive. It's specifically often in Czech speaking areas that the baborki dress is white with a red sash, and that's where they comb their hair in front of their face. In the more German speaking areas, you have the barbella, and they have the moss covered face, or sometimes scary wooden masks. And these are all women, and sometimes they team up with the young men from the town, and they are the Klausen, who are kind of the furry Krampus figure. And, it's all good fun. Another important saint's day that falls during this Christmas season is St. Lucy's Day. Now, St. Lucy or Lucia or Luce, depending on the language, this was a 3rd century martyr. But in the old Julian calendar, her saint's day fell on the solstice. It's December 13th, which is no longer the solstice, but because it was, she became particularly associated with light, and became a particularly popular saint across much of Europe. Now, in Scandinavia today, St. Lucia's Day on December 13th, that's considered the start of the Christmas season. In some areas, it's actually unlucky to put up Christmas decorations before that time. And today, often you'll have the oldest daughter in the family dress up in a white dress with a red sash and a crown of candles, and they will serve coffee and saffron buns and things. But that's a fairly modern tradition. It's really the late 1800s that emerges. Go back further, and Lucy was actually something to be afraid of. There was the Luce or the Luca or various other figures whose name is related to Lucy. And this was a sort of scary witch-like woman who on St. Lucy's Eve would go around with a large knife and slit the bellies of children who did not observe a fast on the evening before her feast. So her feast day is December 13th. You're supposed to fast the day before that. If you weren't fasting, Lucy would cut open your stomach and remove your intestines and then fill it with straw. And you wouldn't be able to eat after that because you'd be filled with straw. And she would sew things out of your intestines. Sometimes this was related to prohibitions against spinning or sewing during the holiday season. That's the old style. Later on, the prohibition is against not spinning. You see, as the introduction of the market economy comes in, a prohibition against working too hard becomes a prohibition against being lazy. But in these traditions, this is particularly popular in Bohemia, so modern kind of Czech Republic. Lucy comes around with a bowl saying, "A bowl for blood, a bowl for guts, a bowl for blood, a bowl for guts." And if that doesn't put you in the Christmas spirit, I don't know what will. Sometimes she has a mask made of a horse skull, maybe a carryover from all those hobby horse traditions. And sometimes she has a big long beak like a bird, almost looks like a plague doctor or something. Now, another sort of scary female figure is Perkta. And there are so many variations of this figure's name. She's Perkta or Berkta, or in the north, Holda or Hala. She's also Bergi, Berkimwado, Perkubaba, Ziamanaba. I can't even pronounce all these. Dozens and dozens of names for similar or related figures. But basically, she's a scary, kind of witchy woman that, much like Lucy, is out to disembowel people. And in different areas, she comes on different days. Sometimes she's one of the dark companions of St. Nicholas. Sometimes she is something that comes on the solstice, so the 21st. Sometimes she comes in the days between Christmas and New Year's, or during the 12 days of Christmas. It really varies quite a lot. In the folklore of Bavaria and Austria, Perkta is said to roam the countryside all winter long, and she enters homes specifically during the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany. And she would know whether the children and young servants of the household had behaved well and worked hard all year. If they had, they might find a small silver coin, and the next day a small silver coin in their shoe. But if they'd not, she slits their bellies open, removes their stomachs and guts, and stuffs the hole with straws and pebbles. She's often an upholder of cultural taboos, just like Lucy was. So again, in some areas, there were taboos against women doing any weaving or spinning during the holidays. And so if you were doing those things, you're working too hard. It's sort of like working on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do that. Then you'd have to watch out for Perkta. And that gets transformed in more recent decades, where if you haven't spun enough flax or you haven't woven enough things, then she punishes you. So it goes from punishing people who work too hard to people who don't work hard enough, but a similarly related tradition. And as far as what Perkta looks like, whatever people wanted. Again, people would dress up as these figures, and it's, you're talking rural people, it's whatever they have. So often they just kind of make their face and hair dirty, they put on a shawl, put on some rags. You're Perkta. Some get more creative. You have some sheep's horns lying around. Now she has horns. You have, an old sheepskin. Now she's furry. You can make up some sort of claw. You can get as creative as you want. Maybe she has a horse skull because you've got one of those. These things were not really standardized until fairly recently, when now these things are starting to get picked up by the internet, and you're starting to get kind of new evolutions of a lot of these traditional creatures. But a lot of the costuming was just whatever people had to dress up as something scary and spooky and scare your kids into good behavior. Now, not all of these sorts of figures were as sinister. One of the most popular old raggedy women that visits people's homes in the Christmas season comes from Italy, and this is La Befana. Now, her name comes from a corruption of Epifana or Epiphany. Perkta, her name probably also comes from the name of Epiphany, and the most common day for Perkta to come is January 6th. Those who have tried to find pagan origins for all this, well, they look at these names and say, it means light. They must have been an ancient light goddess. But the name Epiphany, which is a Christian holiday, means the coming of light. And so actually it's probably more related to that. But again, these traditions, when they were first getting started, it's in rural villages with illiterate peasants. We don't really know the history. So anyone who says anything with too much confidence is probably not being as honest as they could be. The honest answer to the origins of most of this stuff is we don't really know. We can have some educated speculation, but we don't really know. Anyway, La Befana, she looks kind of like what Americans would recognize as a witch. So she's a kind of crone old woman in rags, pointy hat. She flies around on a broom. And she usually delivers gifts to children throughout Italy on Epiphany Eve. But back in the day, it was also common for her to deliver capital punishment and occasionally even drag off naughty children. In fact, in some regions, she's the leader of the wild hunt. Perkta, by the way, also one of the main leaders of the wild hunt. A legend eventually sort of attached itself to her that she had been a woman who lived in Bethlehem, and she was approached by the three wise men, or the magi. They asked for directions to where the Son of God was, and she said, "Oh yeah, over there." But she was too busy with her work to accompany them, and somehow this cursed her to forever roam. But she has a soft spot for children, and she'll give them gifts. And in some parts of Italy, especially the central regions, on Epiphany Eve is also when you go mumming. So again, dressing up in costumes, going door to door, kind of trick-or-treating style. Now, this has been a mile wide and an inch deep. And again, I had a slideshow prepared for a lot of this, and I wasn't able to upload those. So I'll have to do this again sometime with all the fun images that I found. But coming back around to the idea of mumming, this idea of dressing up in costumes, going door to door, getting treats, playing tricks, incredibly common and associated with all different days through the Christmas season. One in Ireland, for example, is the day after Christmas. December 26th is Wren's Day. And you would dress up in straw and costumes and also hunt a wren, so the bird, W-R-E-N. And if you killed the wren, you would then have that wren on a pole, and you'd go to door and sing the wren song and beg for treats. So that's another regional variation. Again, we are Minnesota unknown, so the only one that I know for a fact happened in Minnesota is the Norwegian tradition of Yule bucking. So that's dressing up between the days of Christmas and New Year's and going door to door. That definitely happened in Minnesota, partly because of all the Norwegian immigrants here. But that is where I will close, but also take questions. I see some comments here, but so far none in the form of a question. Anyone has any curiosities, I would love to try to answer that. But otherwise, I want to thank you all for showing up. This is the very first time we've tried a live stream, and I have no idea, technologically speaking, what I'm doing. And we're going to hopefully do many more of these and figure it out. But we figured there's no way to learn like diving in. So this was just a fun chance to talk about some dark and spooky Christmas time traditions. So happy holidays, whatever you celebrate, and hopefully you don't have any disemboweling witches or any cannibals or any other scary things. Why are the drawers in the kitchen empty, says Silly Crystal. That I don't. Can you elaborate on that? Well, I tell you what, at this point, I think I'm going to call that the end of this live stream. Again, if you caught any part of this, thank you so much. This is just a sort of fun little side project of ours. Our main thing is giving history walking tours in the state of Minnesota. So check out minnesotaunknown.com to see some of our upcoming tours. We haven't announced dates yet, but we've got a tour of Summit Avenue. We've got a tour of downtown Minneapolis coming up this spring. And we'll have other things. If you want to get all the announcements, you can subscribe to an email list on our website there. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram, Minnesota Unknown. You can find us on TikTok, Minnesota Unknown, at least until they ban it. So don't be a stranger, reach out, and thank you all for watching. Good night.